Okay. All right. So yeah, I may wander around, in which case I will try and use the mic, but let me try and see if I can stick to the mic rather than move around. So good afternoon, everyone. I am going to be talking today about authoring, and I'll cover different aspects of authoring as I proceed through my talk. Okay. So I'll begin with a brief background, talk about what my background is, which perspective I'm speaking from. So this will give you a little bit of orientation where I'm speaking from, also where I come from. And then the core of this presentation will be about authoring for IEEE. Why IEEE? That's the community which I come from. Authoring for other communities is similar, with small differences, which will vary from community to community. So I will try and speak to them to the extent I know, but other things you will have to find out from your community. I cannot answer all the questions. And then a substantial amount of time I will also devote to the issue of publication ethics. This is something that comes up increasingly in submissions that we receive. So I will devote considerable time. And one quick clarification, questions are welcome. In fact, questions is what will make this much more engaging and useful both for you and for me. If you give a professor the chance to just go on lecturing you, they will never stop. So your best opportunity is to actually ask questions. So please jump in with questions at any point in time. And finally, I'll end with a quick summary. Okay. So this is my background as it relates to publications. I've been an author. I currently also have a number of patents and inventions related to the work we've done. I currently serve as editor-in-chief for the IEEE transactions on image processing. So in that role, I'm making decisions on manuscripts that are received, both in terms of pre-screening to see whether they should go on for review, and in terms of acceptance, as well as things like author appeals, or when there are issues of misconduct. Okay. I previously also served in the role of editor-in-chief for a different journal, which was not IEEE. This was the Journal of Electronic Imaging, which is published by SPIE and ISNT. Okay. I am also involved at the moment on the IEEE Publications Board. This is the governing body that governs IEEE publications and the policy for IEEE publications. So, unlike for-profit publishers, a scientific society has a whole hierarchy and a structure, and that also gives you as an author avenues to ensure that you are treated fairly. So if you feel you're treated unfairly, you can appeal at the higher level and go above the EIC also. For-profit publishers often give you no avenues to appeal to in case an EIC says something and things are closed beyond that. Okay. Right. I've also served previously as the chair for the editor-in-chief. Editor-in-chief. Okay, thank you. Yeah. And I also served previously on the Conference Publications Committee for the IEEE, and prior to that in various other roles in publications as technical program co-chair of a conference and so on. Okay. So that's the experience I'll be drawing from in speaking today. Okay. This is where I come from. So the X marks the spot. So most people, when they hear New York, they think of New York City. New York City is close to the coast. The X is about 360 miles from New York City, so it's a fair distance in this case. Okay. And again, the X is marking the spot where the university is located. It's located on the banks of the River Genesee, which is a river which flows northward into Lake Ontario. On the north of Lake Ontario is Canada. Okay. This is our campus on the side of the river. This is the campus which houses arts, science, and engineering. It's a very nice campus, particularly in summer. In winter, we have a good amount of snowfall. And the campus on the right-hand side, not in this picture, is our medical school. So it's very conveniently located, close to us, which is quite conducive for collaborations for engineering and medicine applications. Okay. And the medical school is actually a much bigger part of the university. So the university, as far as universities go, is a small university. We have about 4,500 students across all 4 years. I do not know what the strength is at JNU, but the institution where I did my PhD, for example, was about 45,000 students. So it's 10 times larger. Okay. And then when you see the tall buildings in downtown, that's where is located the Eastman School of Music. And that's one of the best schools of music in the Western world. I will occasionally have students who are trying to do a major both in music and electrical engineering. And the electrical engineering is the easier one by far. Okay. Right. And this is our main library. Yeah. This is the Rashtri's library, and the grounds in front of which we have a convocation in summer. Right. Okay. So with that quick introduction, I will now jump into the main core of this presentation. I will try and structure this to talk about different elements involved in publishing. I'll talk about choices, choosing an audience, paper structure. So roughly speaking, this will be organized in two parts. The first part will be about writing, about things you may want to think about when you're writing a paper. And the second part will be about publication ethics and etiquette. Okay, all right. Any questions? Oh, right. Okay, so why does one want to publish? So you can have different motivations why you may want to publish. This is the established tradition in science. You publish what you discover, then other people build upon it. So Newton, who was one of the giants in science, is credited with having said, "I have seen thus far because I have stood on the shoulders of giants." So the common tradition in science is, once you make an advance, you publish, you share it with others, others can build upon it and take things further. Okay. Once you publish, you also gain prestige and recognition. You're recognized for what you have advanced. Okay. Obviously, it could also be a requirement for some degrees, so that may be motivation for some of you, particularly those of you who are students. In order to complete your degree, you may be required to publish. And then if you're in an academic career like I am, then a lot of your assessment in terms of promotion, tenure, and so on, publications play a key role. Okay? So these are some of the primary benefits that you can expect from publishing. But I'll also highlight some secondary benefits that you get. Trying to logically lay out what you have done and present it clearly gives you a much better understanding of what you have accomplished. Okay? So your own work you will understand much better when you try and describe it and write it clearly. Even though it's your work, you will have a better understanding of it when you take the time to say, what is it that you have done? How does it differ from what has already existed? What is your contribution? Okay. Also in this process, you will have to ask questions. Why did I do this? Why did I not do that? Why? Why would you be asking the question of why you did something, why you did not do something else? Because if you don't ask the question, who will ask the question? The reviewers will ask the question. Okay, so it's better for you to anticipate. When you ask that question, often some of the why you didn't do something, the answer to that is you didn't think about it or you were just lazy. And in that case, the response is you have to do those things. So they'll always also give you new ideas what you can do and makes the work much more complete than if you were to not try and write it up. Okay. So this process of writing promotes logical thought and organization and also spurs new ideas, not only from people who are going to read your manuscript, but also for you. Even as an author who's fairly experienced, I cannot tell you the number of times I will have a manuscript which is ready to go, and as we are writing it, we'll realize, wait a minute, this one thing is a better way to do it in this manner. And that causes us to revisit that and do that differently. Okay. All right. So in terms of what avenues you have for publishing, the two primary avenues for scientific publishing tend to be journals and conferences. Journal, so I will be speaking at this from the IEEE type perspective, which is the engineering community. In the engineering community, usually the conferences are meant to be for reports on work in progress. As you're making progress on certain thing, you report it. It also establishes precedents. You're the first one to do something, so you reported it. At that point in time, somebody else comes and does the same thing, you still have the conference paper to point to, say I did this first. Okay. So that's one of the advantages of conferences. So it's sort of, usually the conference papers are short. In our community, the conference papers are typically about 4 pages, plus a page for references. Okay, is allowed. The journal papers, on the other hand, are meant to be a complete investigation of a particular point and answer all possible questions that you could imagine on that. Okay. So what are logical questions related to that work should be comprehensively answered in the investigation in a journal paper. For the journal for which I'm the editor-in-chief, that would be transactions and image processing. Typical papers are 10 pages to 13 pages is the typical length for a paper in that case. Whereas a conference, I said earlier, is about 4 pages. Okay. So often students will write a conference paper first because it's shorter. It's also something they can do while they're starting and learning how to write, and then go on to write journal papers. Okay. Maybe as a show of hand, maybe I will have how many of you from the engineering community? Oh, okay. So a substantial part of the people are from the engineering community. That is good to know. So the presentation will be oriented towards you in some sense. For others, the presentation will cover many of the aspects that you encounter too, but some details may vary. Okay. Now, in the IEEE universe of publishing, there's a variety of journals and conferences. One thing to keep in mind if you're trying to submit to a conference is the purpose of a conference is also to promote interaction. So it's expected that you will be there to interact with other authors. You will gain from speaking to other authors. Similarly, other authors, other attendees are expected to gain by speaking to you. So if you're submitting a paper to a conference, it's expected you will be there to present. Okay. So IEEE policy, for that reason, requires that if a paper is not presented by any author or a reasonable substitute, in rare circumstances where that may be required, the paper will not appear in final form. Okay. And that's the motivation for the policy. Journals, on the other hand, do not have that restriction, and the acceptance rate is typically higher for conferences than for journals. The idea is you want to give people the opportunity to participate, so you want to be inclusive. Obviously, you do not want to publish garbage, so you will, if you have total junk, that is not appropriate for a conference either. You should have something which is valid. All right. Okay. In the IEEE universe, there are about 193, I think this was already covered. There are about 193 journals and over 1,700 conferences at this point in time. Okay. So now I'll talk about writing your paper. The first thing to consider is who are you writing this for? Okay. So who's reading technical papers? So people who are technical persons. So these could be engineers, scientists, educators, and researchers. They could be employed in different places. They could be in academic institutions such as this one. They could be in government jobs. They could be in companies. Okay. So these are the people who are going to read a paper. Why are they reading a paper? To try and find out what is the advance, whether they can use it in some way, or whether they can make a further advance upon it. Okay. The authors are also a subset usually of the same audience. They're also people who are either in academia, government, or in a company somewhere. Okay. And the motivations for why people are writing, we already discussed this, they can vary. And I'll highlight sort of two cases. Usually students will write a conference paper before they write a fully developed journal paper, because that's easier and that also gets them started on something before they are writing a full-fledged journal paper. In industry, on the other hand, often the importance is on participation in the conference, getting to know what is the latest development, and they will write a paper to share some part of their work, but there may not be a strong motivation to publish a journal paper. So industry participants will often publish their work only in a conference. All right. Now what stands between you and your paper getting published is the thing called peer review. Okay. I put the peer in quotes. What does a peer mean? Somebody who's your equal or the same. Well, so that's why I put it in quotes. It's called peer review, but it's meant to be a review by people who have expertise in the topic that you're publishing on. So depending on what stage you are at, they may be your peers, or they may be people who are much more experienced than you. Okay. How is the expertise established? How do you decide somebody is an expert in something in this world of publishing? By their publications. So prior publications are what establish who are the appropriate person to reference to review a given manuscript. Okay. So the typical process is that when you submit a manuscript, the editor-in-chief will screen to see with meet basic requirements. Is it appropriate for the journal? If so, they will assign it to an associate editor who is responsible for coordinating the peer review. They'll identify with the goal of getting 3 to 5 people who will respond to provide an assessment of the manuscript. They become the peer reviewers. And they're identified primarily by their prior publications and expertise in this topic. In some cases, you may have peer reviewers from industry who have expertise but may not have published as extensively in that topic. Okay? And once you receive the feedback from these reviewers, the associate editor and the editor-in-chief will make a decision informed by the reviewers. This is a judgment made by a human exercising the discretion. This is not democracy. So if you get 2 reviewers saying accept, 1 reviewer saying reject, does not mean the paper will get accepted. Why? If you have 2 reviewers saying reject, 1 saying accept, the paper may still be accepted or may still be rejected. Why? Well, maybe the 2 reviewers just said reject, provided no details. The one who says accept goes on to detail saying, oh, this paper advances this technology in this manner, this is the way it's useful, this is what it can contribute. So that's where the discretion of the associate editor and the editor-in-chief comes in. They're looking to see how much you have justified the assessment you've made and the claims you're making about the work. Okay. So this is a decision made by a human exercising the discretion informed by the reviews in this case. What are typical IEEE editors and reviewers looking for in the IEEE universe? So clearly you're looking for content which is appropriate in scope and level. Okay. What do I mean by that? Okay. And how can you assess whether your paper is appropriate in scope for a given journal? So how would you assess whether your paper is appropriate in scope for a given journal? What could you do? Okay. Big one? Somebody in the back saying?
By checking other papers from the same journal.
That's a very good advice. So you can do two things. One is check the scope statement for the journal. The better advice is also to check what are the papers, other papers published in the journal. Why? Because description in words is often not clear enough. An example often gives you a much better idea of what should be included. Okay? To give an example in case, my journal is called IEEE Transactions in Image Processing. It is focused on fundamental algorithmic and theoretic novelty in image processing. Okay? So its applications are welcome as long as the applications also have fundamental novelty in the methodology. Okay? So if you use known techniques in image processing to solve a problem, say you're doing crack inspection in buildings, but you're using all known techniques, that is not particularly well suited for the journal because the emphasis of the journal is on new techniques. On the other hand, if it's a journal focused on inspection and materials, that is the one for which that work would be more suited. Okay? So that's both covering the scope and the level in terms of how your work relates to that. And a good idea is to look both at the scope statement as well as to look at what is published in this journal. That will give you a flavor for whether your journal paper is appropriate or not. Okay. The second thing you're looking for is the content should be clearly written and addresses either a problem which is new, so you could either be proposing a new problem that you're addressing, or an improvement on an existing problem that is significant enough to be published. Okay. The methods and techniques you should be using should be validated, should be justifying what you're using and what and why. You should be using appropriate tools such as illustrations, tables, graphs, and then references that are current and relevant to what you're presenting. So converse of this, on the flip side, is the reason why manuscripts often get rejected in this case. Okay. If you have a manuscript which is not matched with the scope, so in my case, I gave you an example already. If you're doing inspection using known techniques in image processing, that's not well matched. And you'll not believe the number of submissions I get of that type. Because we do accept applications, but not applications which do not have novelty in the methodology also. Okay. Obviously, if you have severe scientific flaws, that would be a grounds for rejection. Maybe the manuscript is poorly written. Okay. This relates also to the last part of the manuscript was misunderstood by the reviewers. So your contribution the reviewers did not understand. So often the first reaction you have, I'm also an author, I also get rejection notices, and the first reaction you have is, these reviewers, they do not know anything. They did not read my manuscript. Okay. So in those situations, my advice for you would be to keep calm, wait a couple of days, and read the reviews again objectively. Okay. Not say all cases, but in 8 cases out of 10 at least, my feeling is, when you do that, you realize, wait a minute, I did not make this clear enough, that's why this reviewer is confused. So it's your job to make things clear, not the reviewer's job to try and do a treasure hunt and figure out what is it that you're contributing. Okay? And so always take the time. Never respond immediately when you get a decision letter. Take the time for you to think rationally and write an appropriately worded letter in case you do want to send something. Okay? Obviously, if the work is previously published, that's not appropriate for publishing again. And if the contribution is small, too small, then that's also not appropriate. Now, you also ought to take into account there are different types of publications. Within IEEE universe, for instance, you have journals which have published full-length papers. Full-length paper is typically about 10 to 13 pages, as I mentioned earlier. It could be about 8 to 13 pages in that range. And you have letters journals which publish shorter papers. Okay. The letter papers is still intended to be full exploration of a particular topic, but maybe the contribution is smaller and the scope is correspondingly smaller. Okay. So those offer alternative avenues. Okay. So then I'll talk about the first part, about preparing your manuscript, and I'll cover this in the typical sections you have in manuscript. By the way, the slides will be shared with everybody who's registered for this session over here. And I think if you've registered and given your email, they'll be sharing the slides with you. So these will be available to you. In particular, I will have some links later for references which will be helpful for you in terms of your own. These different elements of the manuscript and things you may want to consider and keep in mind while writing these. Okay. The first element is usually the title. This is telling the reader essentially, should they invest more time in reading the rest of the manuscript or not? Is this of something to interest to them, that should be of interest to them or not? That's the decision that the reader will make based on looking at the title. So it's got to be fairly short. In this fairly short title, you want to communicate what is this about and is this of potential interest. So I'll give you two examples. The first example is a title I could use for every paper I write. How we solved an important problem in a certain application. So it's an evergreen title, I can use it for every paper. Is it a good title? What's wrong about it? Beg your pardon?
It's not specific.
It's not specific, exactly right. It's too vague. It applies to everything, it's not specific enough. Okay. The second title is, yes?
It provides less of the insight regarding the...
What you've actually done. That's right. So the second title is a title from a paper that we wrote a short while back. That one gives you an example of something which is more specific. So it spells out, okay, the work is about color barcodes. What kind of technique we are using? We're using a per color and channel approach. Where does it apply? Mobile applications. And what is the novelty? An interference cancellation approach. So in the title, we've covered these different elements, which then a reader can judge and decide whether this is useful for them. Okay. So you want it to be crisp and concise while communicating the maximum amount of information that you can put in. Okay. Abstract is what comes next after the title. The abstract is a summary of what you're going to present in the entire paper. Okay. Presented at about 150 to 250 words. So it's a fairly short summary of the entire paper. In that short summary, you have to cover what is the significance, why is this problem important, what is new, what is the novelty, what is the methodology, what is it that you have done, what are the main findings, and what are the conclusions. This is quite challenging to do in 150 to 250 words. Okay. Like Mark Twain is credited with the saying, I would have written you a shorter letter, but I did not have the time. Okay. Writing in brief actually takes more time because you have to take the time to make sure you've completed all the main points and communicated clearly. Okay. The abstract is actually quite important. After the title, this is what any reader will see in the paper and decide whether they can read further or not and whether they should read further or not. Okay. If based on the title in the abstract, the reader judges they cannot understand what this paper is about, what do you think the reaction will be? Well, so that's the reviewer. Reviewer will decide to reject. If your paper gets published also, and somehow you have a reader who's looking at it, if by the abstract and title they cannot understand, they say, oh, the chances that I'll understand the rest are even low. It's better off I look at something else. Okay. So that's the readership. Importantly, this also plays a key role in the review process. If I get a submission to my journal, and based on the title and abstract, I cannot make out what this paper is about, who should be the appropriate associate editor for handling this, my response is, this is to be immediately rejected. This is not something which should proceed for review. Okay. Now, several of you here are students. Often when you get your paper done, you're completely tired of writing. You don't want to think about writing anymore. Okay. And you're often putting the abstract together at the very end. Okay. And you say, okay, I'm done with everything. Let me put together my abstract in 15 minutes and be done with this submission. I will strongly recommend you should not do that. Okay. because many key decisions in the review process are going to be based primarily on the title and the abstract. For my journal, I get between 150 to 200 submissions in a month. There is no way I can read each of them to figure out whether they are worth pursuing if they do not clearly articulate what is the new and novel contribution in the title and the abstract. Okay. So take the time. Do not make this as an afterthought. Make sure you take the time to write it. The suggestion which I give to my students is to actually write a tentative abstract as the starting point for the paper. It's tentative, it's not final, but it's a roadmap for how you're planning to write the paper. Okay? So that roadmap serves as a useful purpose. If the paper deviates from the roadmap, either you need to change the roadmap or you need to change the paper. And usually you will be in the process of writing, you will change both. And when you finalize, that's when you want to revisit the abstract and polish it nicely, both to avoid redundancy and to make sure it covers the main points. Any questions on this part? So here's an example from the same paper which I talked about. I will not spend time reading this in detail, but I've highlighted the parts which talk about what we did. So we are proposing a framework for color barcodes, how we did it. Okay, it's quite simple. That's the reason why I've chosen this paper. The printing is done in cyan, magenta, and yellow channels. We embed a barcode in each of those. And then correspondingly, the capture is done red, green, and blue. We decode the barcode from those three channels. Okay. So that's how we did it. What is the challenge? Challenge here is you have coupling between the channels, which we call cross-channel interference. That's also how we handle that, is by estimating the parameters and undoing the effect of interference. Okay. How the results move the field forward? For the same footprint, we can put in 3 times the data. That's the one in purple over here. Okay. Then finally, what are the main results and where do they apply? We've done this both for QR codes and Aztec codes. We demonstrated this. And the error rates that we get, we successfully overcome the impact of color interference and provide low bit error rates, which you can correct with error correction codes. In this case. Okay. Some points that I want to make about this. This is in the first person and present tense. Traditionally, maybe 30, 40 years ago, it was traditional in science to write everything in passive voice, not in first person. It used to be considered immodest to try and say things in the first person. That is now gone. It's more or less accepted that you will write directly because it makes things easier and often shorter to write in this manner. Okay. I was going to critique that in a moment. So let me first cover the other part you want to make sure is you want to have no unneeded words or sentences, and you want to be specific to the extent possible, focusing on the audience. Okay. So I was going to ask what is wrong with this abstract. Somebody pointed out already, this abstract is too big. Okay. So above all rules, I will tell you, is the rule of common sense. Okay. And there are no rules I can make which can codify common sense, and nobody in the world can make rules which can codify common sense. You start making more and more rules, and you will always have something above it. So keep that in mind. So you want to exercise your judgment and discretion and decide to follow the rules, but also exercise common sense. Why is this abstract on the longer side? Okay. So for the journal we were publishing, color printing is not necessarily the common audience that everybody would understand. So we want to provide the appropriate context for that. So that requires the abstract to have a little bit of that context in that setting. That makes it longer in the setting. Okay. So that's one reason for the length. Okay. What's the other criticism of this abstract? What's the other thing which is not good with this abstract?
Running statements.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, running statements I guess.
Running statements, there are a few running statements, but I'll give you an example of other things which will be a bit worse than that. The other thing which is from an engineering standpoint, what is not good about this abstract is the conclusions and findings are not specified in numerical terms. I'm giving only the summary in qualitative terms, not in quantitative terms. Okay. What's the reason for that? Well, we did experiments with several different types of codes. We start putting the numbers in, that will make it even more longer and harder to somebody to absorb quickly.
That is the part of conclusion now.
Beg your pardon?
That is the part of conclusion.
That's a part of conclusion, but ideally in engineering manuscripts, you also want to give your main findings, summarize them quantitatively in the abstract.
This time faster, and we have proved that this algorithm is this time faster than the existing one, and that will certainly grab the attention of the reviewer.
That is right, but if you compare, the algorithm has 5 different flavors, some of which are faster, some of which are better, and so on, then trying to put all of that in the abstract will make it even longer. Okay? So that was the situation over here. Because we did the experiment with several different types of codes, what we are presenting is a framework, not just a particular design of a barcode. We did experiments with multiple codes to demonstrate that, and putting that would have made it even longer. So that was the trade-off. That's the reason why these findings are not summarized in a quantitative manner.
In case we are just not wandering in so many algorithms, and we are just focusing on a particular problem, and there are, let us say, 2 solutions for that, and
Okay.
we are proposing the third one, can we go for giving the numerical data in the conclusion in this abstract?
It is a good idea. It's normally you want to, so this is the part I say over here, be as specific as you can be. So again, you want to be specific. It's always better to give numerical data and be specific. But if there are other reasons why that makes it awkward or unduly long, then exercise your judgment. And that's the rule of common sense, which I said, which has to trounce all other rules.
So if we will add the results and abstract, then what is the need of conclusion?
So what is the need for conclusion? So the abstract is a summary of the rest of the articles. Then you will say, what is the need for the abstract?
So that we are adding the results also, no?
The results, but they're very, very short summary of the results. What are the main findings and conclusions? Whereas the conclusions can have a more of what are the findings. And they can also have a discussion about how it relates to others, and how what more further work you can do can also be put in the conclusion. Any other questions? Okay, all right. So here's an example of another abstract. This is something I took from Archive recently. So the abstract begins with "in this paper." That's 3 needless words. Everything you're going to talk about is going to be in this paper, relate to the paper. So those 3 words can be dropped without any change of information. Somebody was talking about run-on sentences. The first sentence here is a good example of that. Okay. In this paper, we introduced the concept of two-way coding, which originates in communication theory, characterizing coding schemes for two-way channels into control theory, particularly to facilitate the analysis and design of feedback control system under injection attacks. So there are many phrases, twists, and turns. By the time you're done with this, you're not clear what this is referring to. Okay. There's also use of jargon. What is two-way coding? Normal reader may or may not be familiar with that. The second sentence goes in the same vein. Moreover, we propose the notion of attack decoupling and show how the controller and two-way coding can be co-designed to nullify the transfer function of the attack to plant, rendering the attack effect 0 both in transient phase and in steady state. So this abstract is quite short, so that's maybe an advantage, but they have not really used the words available to them to clearly communicate to the audience what this paper is about. Okay. This abstract may appeal probably only to somebody who's already working in this area. Somebody's closely working on the same topic, they could possibly follow it. Somebody who's even a little bit removed from this topic will have a challenge understanding what they're talking about, given this manner. Okay. So you want to aim for a broader audience for your paper. You want to have people be interested in your paper, understand what it's about, and then see if they want to read the rest or not, rather than at the very outset put in barriers which say, if you don't understand these terms, this paper is not for you.
What does the reviewer think when, like, if I want it to be a very typically technically sound paper, so should it not be restricted to a particular audience?
The audience of your paper is determined by the journal you're submitting to. Okay. So from that, you will have some idea of what people are already familiar with and to what extent this is the common thing in the journal. Because the journal scope is usually quite large. There will be topics which will be mainstream, and there will also be topics which are on the fringes, which may not be that mainstream.
Normally, when we talk about conference, then we can say that it is a very broader audience. There are several tracks on that conference chart. But when you are talking about the journal, that is a very selective audience we are talking about.
Not really. A journal audience is also quite large. If you take the transactions and image processing is quite a large field. So there are a lot of papers, there are a lot of subgroups in image processing working on specific topics. They could be working on super resolution, they could be working on image quality, and so you want your paper at least to be broadly understood, the abstract to be understood by the broadest possible audience that you can, given the length constraints that you have.
But nowadays we also have a mixed discipline journals. In that case, the abstract should be defined, concise, or it should be a big.
Nowadays you also have mixed discipline journals. So again, you have to exercise common sense, as I said, about everything else. Who are you trying to reach? So that's your judgment that has to come into play. Whether you would want to reach only people. So you could justify this abstract by saying, people who are working in this field know exactly what two-way coding is, know exactly what these adapt channels that are being talked about are. So why do you want to broaden this in any way? Okay. So that's your choice. But as authors, you're writing an article, it's worth investing the time to make it appreciable by a broader audience.
Sometimes too simplification does not reduce the quality.
Okay, so that's a good question. Sometimes too much simplification does not reduce the quality. Okay, so I will actually answer that in two parts. Simplification never reduces the quality. It improves the quality because the readers can understand it easily. Now, on the second part, if the reviewers understand it easily, they may trivialize the work. There is some danger of that. Okay? So, the advice I give my students is you write your paper clearly. It will be harder to get it through the review process, but once you get it through the review process, the readers will appreciate it better. So the question is whether you're trying to sort of targeting the reviewers or you're targeting the reader. Okay? If you want to target the reader and actually have people read the paper well, then it's much better to have simple and clear rather than try and obfuscate ideas. Okay? And the worst experience you can have is you have a paper which sounds very, very high-flown and great. You spend your time reading that, maybe 2 months reading that. At the end of it, you discover, Khoda pahad nikla chuha. That essentially what they were trying to prove or conclude, they assumed to start with. Sometimes you have that experience also. What's your opinion about the authors after that happens? Okay. Any further paper by these authors, I do not want to look at. Okay. And trust me, in the community, if you publish, you develop a reputation according to what you do. And the people who will tell you point blank, oh, that author's papers, you can trust them to have no content. If you finally understand them. So they may write these papers in a confusing way and get them through the review process in some manner, but does not really earn them the respect of the people who really matter. After the abstract is normally a set of keywords. These are important to consider because nowadays a lot of search engines rely on these. So you want these to be applicable and specific to your article. So specific so that if somebody is looking for exactly this topic, your article is the one which shows up, and searchable in this manner. Following the keywords is the main body of the paper. The main body typically begins with the introduction. The introduction is the opening part of the paper. It's normally structured in the form that I have laid out over here. So you begin with a section which motivates the work. What is the motivation for the problem? Why is this problem of interest? And then you can think about it as going from general and driving the reader towards the work you're going to present. Okay, so you talk about the generally known information about the topic. This will have references. This will be covering the published literature, but on a general topic. Then you narrow it down to literature related to your own work, the one which relates more closely to your own work. So prior studies, historical context for your research, and this then narrows down the reader's attention to what you're going to talk about. You then give a summary of what you're going to talk about in the rest of the paper. You give an overview of the work, what are the main results, and importantly, what are the contributions. So if you're looking for an articulation of the contributions of a paper to see whether this is significant or not, this is the section that the associate editor and the editor-in-chief will be looking at in this case. So it's important to make sure this is nice and well polished and clearly articulates what are the main contributions. Last part of the introduction is typically a paragraph which describes how the rest of the paper is going to be organized. Okay? So this introduction should be specific, should not be vague and too broad. A guidance for a journal article of about 10 to 13 pages is about 2 pages, is the reasonable length for the introduction. And the current guidance is it should be written in the present tense rather than past tense. It should not have an sort of disconnected aggregation of statements about past works. Person A did this, person B did this, person C did this. That's not the goal of the introduction. Okay? Your goal is to give the reader some structure. That is also what you're contributing as an author. You're laying out the prior work and structuring it in a certain manner and giving that structure and orienting the reader in that manner. Repeating things does not make anything stronger. So you have to be careful. In writing, always you will have repetition in your first draft. And be careful to edit to the point where you made things, avoided needless repetition. Okay. Sometimes when your paper goes to review, the reviewer may suggest, oh, why don't you discuss the connections between your work with this other thing? Okay. Some cases, those connections can be made in the introduction. Other cases, they may be tangential. Okay. In those tangential cases, I think it's best not to make those connections in the introduction, because making those connections becomes quite awkward and it essentially interferes with the flow of your entire introduction. The appropriate way to do that is you defer that to the discussion. And the discussion is where you can make these tangential references and say how things connect elsewhere. I'll give an example of that later. Okay. And obviously irrelevant discussions should not be included. So if you have 2 papers you've written, just because you want to use similar kind of structure and maybe use some of the same references does not mean you should use things which are irrelevant to a subsequent paper.
So, what should be the length of introduction for the conference papers?
Rough length for introduction for conference paper would be under a page. So you would like your abstract and introduction to not go too much into the second page. You have the abstract and the introduction. Maybe the introduction can go a little bit into the second page, but not too much. Now, as with all things I said, what is the rule above all rules? Common sense. Okay. So if you are introducing your paper to a conference, which that topic is not commonly covered, you want to have a little more background so that people can appreciate what you're talking about. Other questions? Following the introduction in engineering papers is the methodology section. This is the main part where you're describing your method, what is it that you're proposing and contributing. So this methodology section will describe essentially the problem formulation. This sounds like a repeat of what was in the introduction. Yes, it is a repeat, but this is now in greater detail. So it will use equations, notation, symbols to introduce the problem that you're formulating so that you formulate it in more concrete terms, and then go on to present what is your approach to solve this. If your paper is about a hypothesis-driven research, this could also be presenting the approach you will take to prove or disprove your hypothesis, whatever your hypothesis is. Okay. This section should use illustrations to clarify ideas and provide citations for components reused from others. Okay. So I talked about setting the context for your prepared paper in the introduction, the way you're setting the context. So there you will be citing papers. The purpose of citing those papers is to set the context for your work. What is the purpose of citations in this section? So I'm saying you should also cite in your approach that you have. What is the purpose of citations here? Why do you need to cite them? Okay, to give credit to the people who originated those ideas. So always keep in mind, the reason you cite things is for 2 purposes. One is to set the context for the work. That's what happens in the introduction for the literature. The other is for giving context, giving credit. That can happen any place. It can happen in the methodology, it can happen in the results, depending upon where you're using things. And both of these are 2 key uses of citations, which are the 2 primary reasons why you have citations. Okay. In describing a methodology, I would strongly suggest that you should use illustrations. You should have a flow chart, some sort of figure illustrating the idea. So here's an example from the paper that I'm using as a running example. Okay. By looking at this figure, you know what we've done in the encoding part. For the encoding, all we do is take the barcodes, print them in the 3 channels of cyan, magenta, yellow, you can independently encode data in each. Okay. Obviously, there'll be text accompanying this, which will describe this, but by looking at the figure, immediately you can get what is the key idea for the encoder. Okay. Similarly, there is the one showing the decoder. The decoder is a little bit more involved. That's where more of the novelty and the contribution is in the work. In the decoder, we have to do things which have to cancel the interference between the channels. That's what is presented over here. Okay. Again, there'll be both a caption associated with the figures, which describes what the figure is showing, what the different things are over here, and also in the narrative, there'll be reference to things like what are these M1, M2, M3 that I have drawn over here. So the things are working together cohesively to convey the idea to the reader, what is the new idea that you're proposing and what you're doing over here. Okay. So any questions on the methodology?
So where to define the literature survey?
Where to define the literature survey? So in most papers, the appropriate place for that is in the introduction. And I covered that. So in the introduction, I had two parts. So generally known information about the topic. So that's the broader context, and that's the broader literature. And then prior historical studies relating to what you're going to propose. So it's narrowing down the reader's attention to what you're going to talk about.
So, but in one page, it is sufficient to add literature survey and discuss about all your methodology and all.
So that the practice varies between communities. In different communities, the practice varies a little bit. In traditional journal papers, the objective of the journal paper is to report your new work. The purpose of the literature is to set the context for the work. And you're expected to do that in a fairly terse manner, okay, in about a page to 2 pages.
So my paper got rejected because I didn't add that literature survey in a separate section.
Okay, so that's what I said. The practice varies between communities. In some communities, they tend to have a section called related work, and they tend to include that. So you have to look at what is accepted in the community that you publish in. Following the methodology is the section on the results, and there's also accompanying discussion with the results. This is the one where you're demonstrating that you've solved the problem or made significant advances on the problem that you're talking about. So this is normally has a number of sections, whether they're implicit or explicit. There will be a number of sections here. Typically, the first part will be describing what are your experiments, what is the analysis that you've done. Okay. So you'll be describing, for instance, what is the setup for your experiments, what data sources did you use, why did you choose these data sources. If you're using some metrics to evaluate your approach, you have to justify why you've chosen these metrics, unless they are very well known. If they're well known metrics in the community, you can just say this is what we will use. If they're not well known, you have to justify why you're using them. So here's an example. In our case, we were doing experiments on several smartphones. This is the table listing what smartphones we used. We also had another table listing what printers we did the experiments on. So both of those were described as part of the experimental setup in this case. This is not part of the methodology. Traditionally in engineering journals, so it varies from community to community and the type of paper that you're writing. So as I said, above all, common sense is what you need to exercise. So there cannot be a hard and fast rule which says this is absolute in this setting. Okay. See that if you're proposing a new algorithm, the algorithm you describe in abstract terms. The algorithm does not depend on the smartphone. If there's a new generation of smartphone, the approach will still work. So that is how you partition the two. What is the new contribution? You present that in the abstract setting without tying down to specific devices. Okay. Now there may be situations where what you're talking about is tied to a particular data set, tied to a particular situation, in which case this would possibly become part of the methodology. So there again, your common sense is what you have to exercise in deciding what is the appropriate organization and appropriate place for certain thing in your paper. Any other question? Okay. So, yeah, all right. Okay. The second part of the results and discussion is typically the results that you have, and these should be presented in summarized form. Okay. So it's not particularly useful to throw a lot of data at the reader and just make a whole set of tables or graphs and leave it to the reader to interpret. Your selection over here is actually helpful in making the paper stronger. Okay. So if you've done a lot of experiments, you are the one who's deciding which are the ones which are important, what are the main points you want to make, and accordingly choosing those to present these in summarized form over here. Okay. So more is not better necessarily. Now some way you would deal with, if you have more results and you cannot put all of them in the main paper, you may want to put something in supplementary material. You may want to put something in supplementary material and have a discussion about it, either in the supplementary material or at the end after you emphasize the main points. Okay. This is where you'll use figures and tables and graphs to illustrate your findings. So when would you use a graph and when would you use a table? Beg your pardon?
After table, we will have graph.
After table you will have graph. Okay, so one approach is to have both a table and a graph. So when you can illustrate the data in a graphical format, usually that is better. Why? It's easier for the reader to comprehend. It's easier for the reader to absorb much easily. Okay, so when possible, use a graph, but sometimes you will have categorical data, yes, no answers in a quiz, something which is categorical, 1, 2, 3, 4 rating or something. In those cases, a table is more appropriate. If you want to give exact values, a table is appropriate. Okay. Sometimes you will have something you presented in a graph, but you also want to provide the exact data because other people may want to compare against your work. And in that case, from the table, they can take the values and just compare their approach with your approach. A good choice in that case is to provide the table and supplementary data. If you're in a community where it's common to compare against prior approaches by using the data from those, it's a good idea to provide supplementary material which provides the tables in that manner. Okay. Any other questions?
So can I mention an API in a research paper? Like I want to use the API to create something new.
Okay.
So can I use the algorithm of API or I have to build my own?
Oh, you can use an algorithm from an API in your paper.
Like
the idea of a paper is you want to do something new and highlight what you have done new. Okay. So if there's an existing API which provides you a component of what you're doing, it's perfectly acceptable to use that. It's perfectly acceptable to use open source code that's available, even closed source code. You could build upon that if you have the license and have the ability to use it. Yeah.
So what will be more impactful if I use that, mention that API or build the same algorithm for that API?
So from the scientific impact perspective, the API, whatever the API does already exists.
Yeah.
So your impact is in what you're doing beyond that.
Yep.
From the scientific impact perspective, there is no difference between the two cases. From the perspective of your experience and what you learn, if you implement it on your own, you will often learn something more. And when you implement it on your own, you will often get some ideas for what you could do different and what you could improve more. Okay. So don't shy away from implementing on your own, but you have to make this trade-off and choice. How much time you have and what your own skill set is. Okay. If you're very good at implementing things, maybe that is the right approach for you to do. If you're very good at assembling things from existing components, then that's not the right thing for you to do. So you watch sports, you have people who run marathons and you have people who run sprints. Usually there's not much intersection between those. Okay. So you've got to decide what your strengths are and accordingly decide what is the appropriate way for you to do research for you. Okay. I've had students of both kinds. I had students who would just refuse to use any existing code. They said it was always easier for them to write code for fairly sophisticated things on their own, and they would write code for fairly sophisticated things over a weekend instead of using existing code. And other students who are excellent at building up a nice framework out of existing pieces of code. Okay? So really you have to make a judgment based on what works for you.
Whether this supplementary data forms the part of the whole length paper? Here.
Okay.
This supplementary data that you're talking about, whether when we have a lot of data with us, then when we are submitting the paper, does this form the part of main paper?
No, it's not considered part of the main paper. It's usually published along with the paper. So most publishers support supplementary data and they will publish it along with the paper. It is submitted along with the review, it's along with the paper for review, it's also reviewed partly.
And do we have to refer it into a text also?
You have to refer it.
How do we refer it? Like, please see the attached document or whatever, I don't know.
Yes, so you will please refer to the supplementary materials.
Okay.
And these days there are good publishing tools that are available to you as an author for open source, as well as options which you may have from an institution. You can use them to appropriately structure things. So for instance, you can number the figures and the tables in the supplementary material as beginning with S. or something else, and then refer to them in your main paper. So it's clear which one you're referring to, whether it's from the supplementary or from the main. So exercise your creativity and your ingenuity to make it as clear and structured as possible.
While submitting through the automated portal, so there is a facility to upload the supplementary data.
That's right.
Thank you.
Usually, most publishers will provide that opportunity for you. Any other question?
Actually, when we used to write a paper on the case study or experience, what we faced in the industry, at that time we got a comment from the reviewer to add more citation.
Okay.
How we are going to add more citation because it's like the real-time experience which we face at the site or the industry.
Okay, so the question is, if you write a paper based on your experience in industry, and the reviewer suggests cite more, add more citations. So there you hope that the associate editor will have the common sense to exercise what is the right discretion. They can either give you guidance in terms of what you can cite. Okay. Sometimes you can establish related context, if not the same problem. If you've not done work on exactly, somebody's not done exactly work on the same problem, you can talk about related problems. And I have also encountered this. Okay. There's a paper which I wrote about a particular phenomenon in document imaging, and the reviewer said, oh, the paper has very few citations because there was little prior work on that. Okay. So the suggestion the reviewer gave was, if there are no citations related to this, at least talk about the related work in document imaging. So then I expanded the introduction, talked about work which was peripherally relevant, maybe not that closely relevant. Okay. This is a delicate balance. You should not let the reviewers force you into citing things which are not relevant. And particularly should not let them force you into citing work by the reviewers. That's something I'll talk about later in the publication ethics and ethics.
In that case, does it not fall in that you are not following the scope of that journal? If the reviewer or the editor feels that you are missing some citations, and you also feel that the work is not done in that particular field.
No, the scope of a journal covers a set of topics. Within a set of topics, you're saying you cannot have new work? That's a very myopic viewpoint. Okay? Within the scope of a journal, you can have new work. If you have fundamentally new work within the scope of the journal, where will you get the directly relevant citations from? And just because there are no directly relevant citations, does not mean it's outside of the scope. Those are two independent considerations. Beg your pardon? So maybe one at a time. Maybe we'll take a question in the back first.
I'm saying that in this situation, you have lots of experimentalists who are working on this thing, and you are submitting a paper into most of the who are working on theory and the things that have already been done. So you don't have anything to prove to your theory, but you have experimental proofs.
So there's no such thing as an experimental proof. It's experimental demonstration. First use the right word. A proof is something which is a mathematical conclusion that follows from assumptions.
I wanted to do something and I did it with an experiment.
Yeah, but that's not a proof. That's a demonstration. That's an experimental demonstration. That's not a proof.
Okay.
No matter how many examples you present, you don't prove anything.
No, I'm experimentally doing it.
Okay.
My results are experiments.
Okay.
My paper is solely experimentally based.
Okay.
So I don't have enough theory to prove it.
Okay.
But I have the experimental results.
Yes, then target an appropriate journal which is focused on the experimental work. Target appropriate journal.
In that particular sense, that is not the scope of that journal.
That's what I said. So target the appropriate journal for what you're presenting.
Hello, sir. Excuse.
Sure.
Sir, my doubt is very much related to his doubt as well, because I am working in machine learning and natural language processing, and I am seeing a new approach in the papers that I am reading. The approach is very much empirical.
Okay.
It means the models and methods which are currently being used, they don't have any theoretical justification for it. What they have is they took a data set, performed the learning algorithm on this model, and after 2-3 days when the model was able to learn the feature of the data set,
yes,
they performed the experiments on the test data set or the holdout data set, and the results obtained from this experiment outperform the current state of art.
Okay.
And many papers are published in the similar fashion. Means
Yes.
they don't have a theoretical approach why their results are better. They are publishing because their results are better
Yes.
then
And
state
so
law.
I didn't say that theory was required for publishing. I didn't say that. So it depends upon what avenue you're publishing, what is the status of things at a given point in time. At the moment, there is a lot of approach towards data-driven algorithms, where data is the one which is contributing a lot of information that you can learn.
Is
The
this
modeling
approach-
techniques you're using are often techniques which are sort of applicable broadly across many domains. If you talk about deep learning, for example,
Yes, sir.
that's something which is applicable across many domains. So the technique is broadly known, but then the novelty comes in terms of how you use the data and how you structure the network appropriately to address a given problem.
Sir, would you approve a paper where the contribution of a researcher was only to tweak change a minor parameter in the previous existing model? For example,
if it's just a minor tweak,
Yes,
then
sir.
it's probably not appropriate.
yes, sir.
Unless by some miracle, with a minor tweak, they've got
Better
a
improvement.
very, very major improvement. Okay? So as I said, you're really trying to balance the two things. You want to report what is the state of the art in the literature. So if your minor tweak somehow is a simple tweak which results in a very, very significant improvement, that is then worth publishing. Okay? If most minor tweaks, however, do not do that. Why? Because the authors would have also tried those minor tweaks. Okay? So they've already tried those minor tweaks, so the chances that a minor tweak will give you a radical improvement is quite small. Now you do a minor tweak, you get a 0.1% improvement, and you say, oh, I've got a 0.1% improvement. That's not really that much of an hour contribution.
So, thank you, sir.
You're welcome. So here's an example of how you can use, sure.
Social sciences articles can be written for this journal.
I didn't get the question.
Under the social and behavioral sciences, the articles can be sent to this journal, can be covered this journal,
Which journal?
this journal.
Oh, I'm not fully familiar with all of IEEE journals. I would think probably there are, if they're not, that's not the primary audience. Social and behavioral sciences are not the primary audience of IEEE journals. So that I would be, but you can look at the journals. It's a pretty wide set of journals they publish. You will have to look at the individual journals to figure out whether there is something which addresses your community, if you're looking at social and behavioral sciences.
The question, sir, was whether social and behavioral science articles will be published in your journal.
Oh, no, the transactions and image processing is not focused on social and behavioral sciences. Okay.
But just to make a comment here, Professor, a lot of the IEEE journals now have articles coming from behavioral sciences as well, because more and more, like for example, ethics of AI falls into the behavioral part of it, the biasness part of it. So a lot of those articles are now coming in.
That's right. So there should be something relevant to the scope of the journal. If you're doing, your focus may be behavioral sciences, but also with a technology element or related to technology. In which case, there are IEEE avenues which would be appropriate for publishing. Okay. So this is an example from one of our papers. This is a different paper which I'm highlighting a table. Just highlight some of the things you can do. So this is talking about what are the sequences, what are the data sets we evaluated, what are the methods we evaluated, what are the metrics we presented in the column along here. Okay? For the metrics, we are giving arrows pointing up and down. What are they indicating? Which direction is better? Is it better for it to be higher or is it better to be lower? So we are orienting the reader and giving them some feedback visually to say this is the direction of the metric which is better. Okay, this is what this is better. Okay. We've also highlighted the best performing technique in bold. So you can use these techniques to make your tables more effective and quickly communicate the idea. That's what I want to highlight in this example over here.
Professor,
Sure.
You have written LLMT, so how you are going to cover that abbreviation?
Okay, so that either is, if it's very commonly accepted in the audience, then that would be not necessary, that would be described in the paper once maybe, and commonly accepted. If it's not, you would normally have something in the figure caption. So the figure caption would cover that. So accompanying the table, there would be a caption that would describe that. So it would either be the table caption or the accompanying text which would highlight this.
Can we use the first and this letter, it should be defined.
That's right. So most journals follow the convention that if you're going to use an acronym, the first time you use it, you define it, and then you consistently use it throughout. That's the practice in most IEEE journals.
So the acronym should be based in the keyword itself?
So that varies from journal to journal. In most, it could be placed in the title also, in some cases, but usually it's a better idea to place it in the first instance that you have in the rest of the paper. Now the final way it will be placed will be determined by the formatting convention of the journal. That's something they will decide, and they will adhere to that consistently throughout their conventions. The final part of the results is really a discussion which interprets the results. So this is where you're pointing out in what way you are better and how much are you better than what has been done before, for example. Okay. Why your research offers a new solution. This is also the opportunity to discuss and point out any limitations. What are the limitations of your work? Okay. It's good to point this out because you deflate the reviewer's criticism by doing this. Okay. If you don't point this out and it's obvious, the reviewer is going to first ask this question. Okay. And this is also the place to potentially highlight connections with other work that I appreciated better after having read the work. Okay. So for example, in this case, I have in the box on the right, I am saying that we also evaluate the performance of the proposed approach on other barcodes, where the data is extracted from the barcode, extracted on a flatbed scanner. Okay. So if you remember, the title of the paper said mobile applications. A flatbed scanner is not particularly mobile. You carry it around. So the technique can be applied in that setting also, but that's not the main focus, which is the reason why this is not mentioned anywhere in the introduction and is deferred to an appendix. Okay. So this is here. You can use this appropriately. As an author, you hold the reins in terms of how you want to structure the paper. As long as you can structure it logically, the reviewers and the readers will appreciate it. So, final part of the paper tends to be usually a conclusion. This is the one which is, the word conclusion in English has two meanings. It's either the ending or what is the finding? What did you conclude? Okay. And unfortunately, this gets mixed sometimes. You should interpret this as what are the main findings, invariably, in engineering journals. Okay. It's not a repeat of the abstract. You do not put everything in the abstract again. Abstract will include the findings. So what is there in the conclusion is summarized in the abstract, but not vice versa. Not everything in the abstract will be there in the conclusion. You do not need to repeat everything from the abstract in the conclusion. Okay. It's a good idea to describe both the benefits and the shortcomings of the solutions you present and your research methodology. Appropriate. Optionally, you may also have an acknowledgement section. That's where you're acknowledging people who provided you help or possibly institutions that provided support.
So we use past tense in conclusion.
Usually in the conclusion, it's common to use past tense. Any other questions? Because at that point, you are done with the paper, you presented the paper.
How do we take the video recordings now with the journals?
Okay. Okay. So most journals allow you to submit supplementary material. A video would be something which would be part of the supplementary material that you submit along with the manuscript. It has to be submitted at the time of review to be published along with the manuscript. And then finally, once the paper is accepted, you also provide the supplementary material and it becomes available on IEEE Explore along with associated metadata. So when you provide supplementary material, when the material paper is accepted, IEEE will request you to provide metadata for it, which describes what this is, and that will go along with Explore in that manner. And they're constantly working to improve that aspect of how you make it present to the audience is something which is constantly being improved.
So does these videos and supplemental material give the extra edge to the paper?
So again, without knowing the paper, one cannot say. If the technique is working on video, then clearly including relevant examples from that would help. Unless it is crystal clear, even without the video. For a lot of techniques, usually a lot of techniques which are working on video, adding a video helps. In some cases, the video can be helpful even if your paper is not about video.
Sir?
Yes.
Sir,
Okay, sure.
I have a very minor doubt, sir.
Sure.
Why journals or publishing house focuses so much on the format of references. It can be changed by the intern of the publishing house as well. Why the format is so much necessary that some papers get rejected just because of the format of references.
So, all right. So I'll come to that. I will references the next section. I will talk about that. So hold your question. I will answer your question, and if not, we'll come back to that. Okay. So here's an example of a conclusion that I presented for the paper that I talked about earlier. So it talks about what is accomplished. It provides a framework, which is an effective method for extending monochrome barcodes to color. What they offer, 3 times the capacity. Also acknowledges in the final sentence what are the limitations. For the bit error rates, and therefore information capacities vary across 3 sibling channels. The error rates are ranges which can readily be corrected by the direction codes. Okay. So here's an example of a conclusion. Again, this does not have numerical values because that would possibly make it too long-winded and harder to appreciate. Then coming to the point on the references, following the conclusion, the last section of the paper is really the references. So I already touched upon why you have these. What are the 2 reasons for these? To give the credit for ideas that you're using and to set the context for the work. So that's the reason why you have these. Okay. Now, there's no limit to the number of references that you can use. But use only the ones which are relevant. Don't just cite for the sake of citation. This is what is ensuring proper attribution. Typically, you want to include article title, publication name, authors, page number. The formatting conventions for this are defined by the journal that you're publishing. Okay. Now, follow the conventions of the journal. IEEE journals normally follow a numbering system. In the paper, there's a number for each citation. And at the end is a list which lists your citations in a reference list. So I have examples listed here from a journal. The first 2 are examples from journals. The third one is from a conference. If you see, there's a minor difference between them where the page numbers appear. One says in, so that's specifying that's a conference. And the last one is an example from a book. Okay. So this is the established convention. This is what the journal defines as their style, format. So this is defined in the journal's convention and format. Why should it be in this format? Well, it's not difficult to make it in this format. Today you have a number of citation managers. You can use BibTeX, you can use Zotero, Mendeley, whatever works for you. You can use these collaboratively with your authors and an appropriate style file, which will put the final citations in the right format. You can download the citations rather than having to type them on your own from the publisher's website when you use the paper. Why is this such an emphasis? If you're giving credit, it should be traceable. If somebody is going to follow your reference and you give an incomplete information, today you may be able to do a Google search and find it. Tomorrow that Google search on the same terms may lead somebody to a different part. So publishers consider them in the business of providing archival information. Archival means it is available for the long run. Okay. That's why they try and emphasize that the citation should be as complete as possible so you can actually locate what was the original source. I'll give an example in point from a recent paper. It's actually not, maybe it's appeared online but not yet appeared in final form. We had cited something which we found on a website and that had a reference to a particular journal. So we had cited as coming from the journal along with the corresponding citation. In the final copy editing process, they asked us, please provide us the volume number for this. Okay. In looking at the volume number, we went back to the journal, we searched for it, and what we discovered was that what we had used was an author preprint. It was never really published in the journal. So we contacted the author, and the author said, you know what, this was never published after review. The reviewers did not like it, so this never ended up getting published. So now we cite the website, and we cite what was the location, whereas the previous reference was incorrect. So publishers do pay keen attention to making sure they fix this. And from you as an author, this is not an undue burden on you. So you have no excuse to say, this is making my life really hard, I cannot do this. Does that answer your question? Okay. Is there another question? Okay. So, all right. So where it's called out, so every reference you use should be called out in the text where you're calling it out, you can be more specific and point out which chapter you're referring to, which chapter or which pages you're referring to.
Seen somebody referring a chapter in a paper, they are referring a chapter of a book.
You've never seen that? No, that is not uncommon. That happens to people.
Then you can just quote the pages where
You can quote the pages or you can quote the chapter. That's up to you, depending on what is most relevant. No, depends on what is relevant. Depends on what is relevant. Depends on what is relevant. If the chapter is relevant, you cite the chapter. If there are specific pages which are relevant, you cite the specific pages. So you're citing for relevance. Other questions?
Now we have the DOI, so why IEEE has not included DOI in the citations?
IEEE will include DOI in the citations if it is there. If the authors provide it, they will include the DOI in the citations. Okay. Now, taking my IEEE hat, I will speak as an author, and I will tell you why I don't include DOI. Okay. Every time I exceed the page length, I have to pay $220 a page. Okay. So if those DOIs are going to push me to an additional page, I have to pay $220 for the change. And this is where I'm the publication board also. I argue against the policy. I think the page charge, overlength page charges need some rationalization to them and are hurting us in the longer run by not including DOIs. Okay, that's my personal opinion, taking off the IEEE hat. Okay. But if you include them, they are happy to include them in citations.
So are we able to include URLs and videos in
The purpose of citations is to give credit. If what you've used is a video or a URL, you should cite that appropriately.
like tools do not include URLs and videos and text, then what we have to do in that case?
You can learn how to use the tool appropriately. Most tools will give you an appropriate way that you can insert it. In BibTeX, you have the tag URL that you can use. And if you use the URL tag, that will then get incorporated. You can modify the style file if required to meet your requirements. Yeah. So most of you are engineers, as you acknowledged. Learn how to also modify the tools and use them. You're supposed to build tools, not just be consumers. Okay.
So how much self-plagiarism is allowed?
How much self-plagiarism is allowed? Okay. So there's no such thing as self-plagiarism. Plagiarism is the use of other people's ideas without attribution or credit. The term self-plagiarism is an oxymoron. What is appropriate is disclosure of what you're reusing prior work from, and then the judgment has to be made by the community in terms of what they accept as reasonable duplication from your own prior publications. I will cover that in the second part when I talk about publication etiquette and ethics. I will touch upon one thing which I will talk about is the issue of impact factor. This has become sort of some be-all, end-all, and this is a terrible thing, I think. You cannot judge impact factor as a measure of popularity. It's also a limited measure of popularity. What you calculate is the number of references to all articles in a journal in a particular time window, often a 2-year time window. Number of articles published in the journal in the 2-year time window in the denominator, and that becomes the impact factor. What are the things which are wrong with it? It's a measure of popularity, not of scientific impact. Any scientist who thinks impact factor is a good measure of scientific merit should think all the actors and actresses are better scientists than them. Okay. Because they have a much higher impact factor. Okay. So usually if you're thinking popularity is what matters, you've chosen the wrong profession. Okay. You should really look at the scientific merit of the work. To assess the scientific merit, you often have to read it in detail.
When do we have to see this impact factor?
So the original intention of the impact factor was it was designed as a tool for librarians to use to see what resources are getting used. Okay. And the librarians exercised the discretion. They knew across different communities. Some communities use tools more frequently, some communities use less, depending on the size of the community. Now all of that has been thrown to the winds, and people are starting to use this as a one number to tout as this is the greatest thing. Okay. So I would suggest you don't use this in any way.
So, but the accreditation bodies and the quality assessment.
So the guidance that I give is for those of you who are in leadership positions, you should try and educate the accreditation bodies. That is the right solution here. The right solution is not to give in to the wrong pressure and accept what is bogus, but to also help educate the accreditation bodies. They are not.
Nature itself has done this all that time. They have given that.
For them it works in their favor. For them it works in their favor.
The pressure is worldwide, it's not.
The pressure is worldwide, it's not just over here. Okay? But I will give you my opinion on it, no matter All right. Okay. It's also quite different between disciplines. So I'll give an example. So when I was in 12th grade, if I take my 12th grade physics book and read it now, most things will still be correct. I take my 12th grade biology book and read it now, many fundamental things will be incorrect. The number of kingdoms that I learned, there were 2 kingdoms. Now people consider biologists think there are 3 kingdoms. Okay? So something as fundamental as that has changed. Okay? So different disciplines are different in terms of the half-use, relevant half-life of published information. In the life sciences and medicine, that is relatively short. Things happen on a fairly quick basis, so the 2-year window works very well for them. On the other hand, for engineering, often discoveries have a longer tail. Something that is discovered today may only be used maybe even 20, 30 years later. I know of examples where somebody came up with a new algorithm. For 30 years, nobody referred to it. Suddenly there was an innovation. This is turbo codes, for example, which are used in many mobile telephony today. For many years, that remained fallow, and then suddenly that paper, because they realized it can be used in turbo decoding, became cited very, very often. Okay. Does it diminish from the work? Not really. Not really. Oh, okay. So, all right. So at this point, I think this is on to a different presentation. Okay. Oh, somehow I already gave you this guidance. I strongly recommend to my students they should start writing early, rather than wait for all the work to be done, because you will get a lot of good ideas when you start writing. However, that's not a reason to submit half-baked work. You should take the time to edit your manuscript, polish it well before you submit it. Check for logical organization, clarity, and brevity in that order. I give this example. If a patient needs both heart surgery and cosmetic surgery, you want to make sure he or she survives the heart surgery first before you start doing the cosmetic surgery. Okay. There's not much point trying to fix issues of clarity and brevity until you've gotten the logical structure right. Okay. That's going to be useless. So first get the logical structure right, then focus on clarity and brevity. Okay. Also check for conformance with the style of the journal you're submitting to. In terms of citations, sections, formatting, etc. Among other things, this indicates that you really are interested in publishing that community, rather than you're thinking that, oh, this community should take whatever I send to them. Okay. All right. There's also some reason why you focus on completeness of information. Okay. For instance, if you're saying that the algorithm improves upon a prior conference paper, one consideration may be how long was the conference paper, meaning how many pages was the conference paper. The conference paper itself was 12 pages. What's new? What is the new contribution here? You need to be more clear about that. Okay. Language and grammar, this is a common issue. Most of us learn English from an early age. However, the English we learn, often the emphasis is on making it ornate and rather flowery. That is not the goal in technical writing. Technical writing, the idea is to have short, precise, and clear sentences. Okay. So you have to unlearn some of the habits you have picked about of writing things in an ornate and flowery style. Okay. Details matter. If you present your work well, if you've done good work, you present it well, it will also be received well. People will appreciate it. On the other hand, you may have done good work. If you present it poorly, it will not be appreciated. Last but not least, don't take the approach that the reviewers will fix the problems. The reviewing process is not meant to be for editing the manuscript, it's meant to be for providing a critical assessment of the manuscript. Any questions on this part?
Professor, sure. We have observed sometimes that normally we use a British English. So sometimes
normally you use what?
British English.
British English, okay.
Like when we use that the spell of sulfur, SULPHUR, and when we submit that paper into the US, then they tag as like yes, FUR.
Okay. So you have to look at the editorial policy of the journal. If they're a British-based journal, they will accept British spelling. If they're an American-based journal, they will accept an American spelling. IEEE journals accept either spelling. It's a choice of the author. However, that's my understanding, at least among most IEEE journals. Okay. However, don't mix the two. Don't use half British and half American in the same paper. Okay, that is a source of confusion. The only place where you would mix the two is in the citations. In the citations, if the title was in a certain English spelling, use that, retain that original spelling. Otherwise, in the main body of the paper, you should not be mixing two.
So, if I'm using IoT to build a product, hardware product, or enhance that product, and further to write a research paper on it, then how should I frame the result part for that paper? Should I make 3D models on it, or what should I do?
Okay, so I don't think I can answer the question without knowing the specifics. How you want to frame the paper is your primary task as an author, is to decide how you want to frame the paper. The suggestion which I would give is frame it in the way which presents your work in the best possible light while being honest. Okay? So you want to think about in what context you want to present your work, which makes it most appealing and highlights its main strengths. If a 3D model is appropriate, that's what you want to use. If on the other hand, the 3D model doesn't really add to it, or the 3D model is just sort of too toy example, whereas your real work includes much more realistic situations, then the 3D model will detract rather than add to the paper. So I don't know, I don't think I fully answered your question, but I don't think I can answer your question fully without knowing the details. Okay. So at this point we have two choices. I have a second segment on publication etiquette and ethics. I can either continue with that right away, or we can take a break for tea and then come back in maybe 5 to 10 minutes. Take a break? Okay, all right, then we will take a break and come back. Then they can probably give you more targeted options, what you may be able to do. Okay, so maybe at this point we've got substantial part of our audience back. We will resume. So in the second part, I'll talk about publication etiquette and ethics. And I want to emphasize this is about both matters, etiquette and ethics. Ethics is usually right and wrong, so it's usually a matter of black and white. Etiquette is a matter of custom, what becomes the common practice. And several things are a matter of etiquette, some things are a matter of ethics, and I'll highlight both of those. To give you the context for why this is important to know, I'll give you sort of behind the scenes what happens when you click submit my manuscript. Okay. And I'll talk about this for a typical journal workflow. Conferences are similar with some minor variations. Okay. So you submit your manuscript as an author. The manuscript goes through several filters, and those are the ones which I'm indicating by the vertical dashed lines. Okay. The first filter is usually the journal staff. They will do basic checks. Submitted manuscript in English. Okay. Have the authors provided all the required information, the contact information? Is there an Orchid for the corresponding author, for example? If not, they will send back the authors to provide that information, or if there's something foundationally wrong, in terms of the manuscript is not in English, they will reject. Okay. Manuscripts which pass this filter go on to the editor-in-chief. The editor-in-chief will look at the manuscript, and typically I will look at the title and the abstract. And I will try and make a decision which one of my editorial board members is appropriately suited for this. Sometimes you will also have classification systems which can also help with that process of deciding who is the appropriate associate editor for this. Okay. I will also make a judgment. Is this in the scope of my journal? Is this appropriate? Does this have enough of a contribution in my assessment? If not, I will process an immediate rejection. Otherwise, I will send this on and assign an associate editor the task of looking at this manuscript. Now, the associate editor normally knows the particular area of the manuscript better than me. They are an expert in that particular area, so they will do further screening. They will look at also seeing whether there is adequate contribution, whether the presentation is clear enough or not. If not, they will consult with me, and there can be an immediate rejection at that stage also. Once the manuscript meets all these filters, it then goes on to formal peer review. Okay. In the formal peer review is where the associate editor will seek opinions on the manuscript and assessment of the manuscript. Typically, the goal is to get opinions from 3 peer reviewers who have expertise in this topic. To currently get opinions from 3 peer reviewers, the associate editors are sending a large number of invitations. Okay. They often have to invite 15 to 20 people to get 3 to commit to doing the reviews. Okay? So keep that in mind as I talk about in further steps. Okay? Once they've got commitments from reviewers, those reviewers are anonymous, meaning the authors do not know who these reviewers are. That is the established practice in scientific publishing. They will provide comments. The comments they provide are communicated to the associate editor. The associate editor will use those comments and make a decision on the manuscript. Decisions can include accept, reject, revise, and resubmit. If it's accepted, maybe there are some minor changes they may indicate that need to be made in the final version. If it's rejected, then it's rejected. The ball is back in the author's court. They can decide what to do with this manuscript. If on the other hand, it's revise and resubmit, the authors get a certain period of time in which they have to revise and resubmit the manuscript. It will then go back to the reviewers. And so this process will then repeat. There may be multiple rounds of this. You will get feedback from the reviewers on the revised manuscript to see if it has addressed the issues that were found in previous rounds. Okay. Ultimately, at the end, usually there will be a decision which says either accept or reject at that point in time. If the manuscript is accepted, you submit final materials, it goes on to publication. Okay. Inserted into this is also checking for plagiarism. So cross-check is a duplication detection tool. It provides you information on where substantial parts of a manuscript have been duplicated from. This is also what is available in a modified form to you as Turnitin at various libraries and institutions. Okay? So for every manuscript that goes to the journal, I will see a cross-check report which shows me in a highlighted form these parts are common with other parts. Okay? There is no fixed percentage which you can say is acceptable or not acceptable, because sometimes the devil is in the detail. Some small words, everybody is using the same words. So small words may overlap. On the other hand, there's an entire paragraph which almost entirely is verbatim from another place. The chances that two people will write the same paragraph in exactly the same way are pretty slim. So that's where the judgment comes in. You look at that and see. Okay. Also, who is it from? Is it from the same authors? Is it from different authors? If it's from your own prior paper, then some amount of overlap is acceptable. If it's from different authors, even that some amount of overlap should be cited. You should acknowledge the prior work. Without citation, that overlap is not acceptable. With citation, some overlap with the prior work may be okay. From some other author, entire borrowed paragraph is not appropriate. So that's the kind of information cross-check provides. But it requires a human to interpret it because of the many ifs, ands, and buts that I presented to you. What's the message that I want to communicate with this slide? When you're submitting a manuscript for peer review, you're going to take the time of a lot of people. Okay. These people are all unpaid volunteers. IEEE is doubling my salary every year. Every year I get exactly $0. So you can say it's doubling, tripling, or whatever factor you want to say every year. Okay. And people are doing this because they belong to the community. And they would like to make sure what is reported in the community is appropriate and accurate. Okay. So this is true for the editor-in-chief, it's true for all the associate editors, it's true for all the reviewers. All of them are doing it as service to the community. This is how scientific publishing is established. Okay. So keep in mind that you're going to consume the time of a lot of people, most of them who are more experienced than you, when you submit a manuscript. Okay. So you should value the time of others when you submit something, and also value your own time. Do not submit something which is half-baked and poorly written. Do your homework first and make sure the manuscript you have submitted is clear, as concise as can be, and highlights the main contributions. Obviously, other aspects about the etiquette and ethics relate to maintaining integrity of the publication process. I'll touch upon each of these in terms of scientific integrity and reproducibility, authorship, also unacceptable conduct such as plagiarism, duplicate submission, and disclosure. I'll cover these in the following slides. So types of misconduct, this is listing some of the types of misconduct that you can have, but the flavors are endless, and you keep discovering new and new flavors as you encounter these in practice. Okay. So So this one I will not talk about much in this slide. I'll come to each of these later. Obviously, what you should be reporting in your paper should be things you've actually done and what you've actually accomplished. It is fraudulent to make up results and data and does not really serve you in the long run. If you somehow manage to get your paper published by introducing fraudulent results in it, it's going to be either a paper that nobody looks at, in which case it doesn't help you much. If anybody looks at the paper, the first thing they'll discover is this doesn't work as stated. This is not valid. And what do you think will be happening in that case? If your fraud is eventually uncovered, it is not a good thing for your career. There are various high-profile cases. People presented examples of human cloning, cold fusion, and so on, which were subsequently debunked. And the careers of these researchers essentially went into ashes. There was no further career for them. So you want to avoid this. You want to build your career on credible science, not on fraud. And this is something which I cannot make dishonest people honest. You have to either believe it or not believe it. I cannot make you turn one way or another. Conflict of interest, this is something that commonly does not arise in engineering publications, particularly for authors, but there may be situations in which you have a financial interest, which may impact the objectivity in assessing and reporting the results. If these cases exist, you should report them. This often happens in medical research. If you're doing drug tests for a company, and the company, you're also investing in the company, or you have ownership stake in the company, then your reporting could be possibly biased. In engineering, this can also happen. You have a startup company, you're comparing algorithms from the startup company versus somebody else, and if that's the basis of your paper, then there's a conflict of interest there that you should probably disclose. The converse is not necessarily true. If you went on to publish a paper, the paper turned out to be a great approach to do something, you patented that also, and then started a company based on that. That is, the order is such that the conflict of interest did not arise at the time of publication. Okay. So plagiarism is something which is a sort of often a source of considerable confusion. So I will spend considerable time talking about this. Plagiarism refers to the use of other people's ideas or words without appropriate attribution. So if there are other people's ideas, it's appropriate for you to use them and build upon them, but what is incumbent upon you? You need to give due credit. You need to cite. Additionally, when you're describing their work, the description is assumed to be in your own words. So paraphrase rather than try and copy from somebody else. Okay. Even when you're describing other people's work, the description in your paper is all in your own words. A good guidance to keep in mind is that everything in your paper that you write is intended to be in your own words unless you clearly demarcate it by quotations. So maybe you want to quote Gandhiji said. In that case, you will say Gandhiji said, begin quotes, a quotation from Gandhiji, citation for where you saw that, and end quotes. Okay. That's a situation where you will use words verbatim from somebody else. Otherwise, you will never use words verbatim from somebody else. Any questions on that part? So even in the introduction, even if it's a literature review, maybe somebody has written a nice literature review. Okay. That is their literature review, not yours. You cannot just say, this person wrote a nice literature review, let me just borrow that. Okay. Some people will try and do a templated approach. This person wrote a nice literature review, I will use the same thing as a template but modify the words. I would strongly discourage that. Why? Because you're given a brain, exercise it. You're given some individuality and creativity also. Present the work from your perspective rather than you following this templated approach, either to the paper or to the introduction. Any questions on this part?
Can we use Wikipedia data as it is?
Can you use Wikipedia data as it is? So if you're giving a quotation from something, then maybe, but that should be a very small part of the paper and then should be again demarcated in quotes or indicated by appropriate demarcation that it's a verbatim part from somewhere. Okay. Otherwise, you should not be using Wikipedia as it is. One situation in which may use Wikipedia data as it is, if you contributed that to Wikipedia. Okay. There was a situation where I was writing a paper, I looked up a reference on Wikipedia, what I wanted to talk about, The difference in Wikipedia did not have the relevant information. So as I wrote the relevant information for my paper, I thought it would be good to also contribute that to Wikipedia. Okay. So I contributed that to Wikipedia, and my paper I indicated the author also contributed this to Wikipedia, so that there wouldn't be this assumption from somebody who sees the duplication, assuming that I just copied it from there. Okay. So above all rules is the rule of common sense. Okay. So keep that in mind. Any other questions? All right. This applies to all elements: graphs, tables, figures, everything. Okay. So you have to give citation. If you use, maybe you're comparing your method versus the published method. So the published method summarizes performance in a table using the same numbers. You should then cite and give acknowledgement. Okay. If you're using a table or a figure from some other place, you have to both cite and make sure you have the right to use it. If it's a copyright owned by somebody, you have to make sure you have the copyright permission to use the figure. The second part I'll touch upon is duplication, redundancies, and multiple submissions. Okay. It's just a taboo practice in the publishing world to submit the same work and try and publish the same work in two places. Okay. There is also fundamental concerns with this. When you submit your paper to a publisher, you're transferring the copyright to them. Okay. So you can't really expect that you can then submit to another publisher. Okay. So you should focus to submit original work that is not under review for another free publication. Okay. In situations where you may be building upon a conference paper, you may have a conference paper, and you may be building a journal paper which builds upon it and does further work, you should still cite the prior work and establish the relationship. Okay. How to do this depends from community to community. Sometimes it's easy to do in the manuscript itself. Sometimes doing it in the manuscript becomes awkward, in which case you could do it in a cover letter or in a supporting document that you submit. A good practice is to read the information for authors for the journal you're submitting to. That will probably give you guidance on this. So for instance, IEEE transactions and image processing, in the instruction for authors, there's an explicit section on conference to journal papers, which is journal papers which are based on prior conference publications. There is no exception to the rule that for every published material that you reuse, there must be a citation. And you should also be clear that you have the rights to use that. Okay. So for instance, if you're using figures, diagrams from a previous paper, you have to make sure you both have you have a citation, also the rights to use. If the material was from a copyrighted source, you should have the copyright permission to reuse it. If it's from a CC BY source, an open source, that gives you the permission to reuse, but still imposes upon you the requirement that you should cite. Okay. So in that case, the citation is required, and you should give the appropriate citation. Okay. Now, one guidance I give to my students is rather than just blindly copy a figure from somewhere else, it's usually better to draw your own, which relates the problem in your context. So that relates it closer to the problem that you're talking to talk about, and can be customized and relate to the specifics you're going to present. It also develops your skills. This is how you learn how to put together an appropriate block diagram, illustration, and so on. So this is something I recommend. You can still base it on something. In that case, the appropriate thing is to say based on or adapted from. You still cite, but the figure is yours. There is no copyright concern anymore in that setting.
What is IEEE transactions take on this behalf? Actually, as the copyright has been transferred from the writer to the IEEE transactions to the journal, can the graphs or the charts be used?
Okay, so IEEE policy is that even though the copyright, so it depends on which journal you're publishing to. So with the new open access world, things have become a little bit murky. If you publish in an open access journal, often the rights are retained by the author. If you're publishing in a traditional journal, then you transfer the copyright to IEEE. When you're transferring the copyright, you sign a copyright agreement. The copyright agreement both has your rights and responsibilities. So as part of the rights that IEEE gives authors, it allows authors to reuse their figures and components from their paper in subsequent publications, provided you cite and acknowledge. Okay? So you can reuse your own figures in later papers, but you still have the requirement to cite.
That you are not the writer of that paper.
Beg your pardon? Oh, okay. So you want to use something from somebody else's paper. Okay. Okay. Then you have to ask IEEE for permission, and there may also be fees involved in that setting. Other questions?
So, for the plagiarism, I mean, how many consecutive words as an editor you take in editing or the plagiarism software?
Okay, the question is, as an editor, how many consecutive words do you take if you see them in cross-check? I don't think there's a hard and fast number. So I'll give you an example. I said last section of the introduction is the organization of the paper. Almost everyone begins by saying, the rest of this paper is organized as follows. Okay, or this paper is organized as follows. Okay. If that is duplicated from one paper to the next, saying that that's a case of plagiarism is really not exercising common sense.
But the software itself has a option, settings in it, where we put the number of words, like 7
Okay.
or 40. So maybe when you are checking, the numbers are already there, so it will, like if we have put 14 words,
Okay.
consecutive 14 words over there, it will not show as a copied or plagiarized content. So as an editor, when you check,
Okay.
there must be a setting behind
So
the scene.
I think the way the setting is set is probably either set by IEEE or by cross-check directly. I do not control that setting myself.
By
Decide.
default, what is there?
That's right. That is the one. Those are the reports which I see, and I look at those reports and interpret appropriately whether this is something to be concerned about or not to be concerned about. And the same guidance I give to my associate editors. Don't just go by a number. Don't just go by the percentage. Look at what is the nature of the overlap. Any other questions on that? Okay. All right. Okay. So I already touched upon this. Reuse of published materials. You should cite and acknowledge, including figures. Okay. The other question that comes up is authorship. Okay. So authorship should be reserved to people who have contributed substantially to the work. And it's not just or, but and. And they should have read the manuscript and agree to being listed as an author on the manuscript. Okay. Both these requirements are important. Now, why is it a requirement that every author should agree to being listed as an author? Well, there are many cases I encounter. I found ethics violations in a paper, and the professor says, the student did this entirely on his own. I had nothing to do with this. What do you think my response is? Well, you are more than happy to get the credit. List yourself as a co-author. If the paper had been published, you would be also a co-author. You also share the blame. Unless you can show some really strange circumstances, which this paper was submitted entirely without your knowledge and without informing you in any way, if you can show that, then maybe you'll be excused. Otherwise, all authors share blame for any misconduct associated with the paper. That is the policy most publishers adopt. Okay. So it's important, if you're a corresponding author, as a student, maybe you're handling the correspondence and submission. It's important that every author that you include should at least be sent a copy of the manuscript, and you get clear affirmation from them agreeing to be listed as an author. Any questions? Authorship is not a friends and family plan. You don't add somebody as an author just because they're your friend. They should genuinely have contributed to the work. Okay. Somebody you discuss things with and who maybe gave you some minor suggestions, you could include them in the acknowledgements and thank them. Okay. If somebody gave you a major idea that contributed to a substantial part of your paper, depending upon what that nature is, you can still acknowledge that as, if it's technical contribution, you can acknowledge that as personal communication in this thing. If somebody worked jointly with you on something to complete part of the paper, then the appropriate thing would be to include them as an author. Okay. And if you're unsure, ask them. And they may say, oh, this is too little, just acknowledge me. In that case, you can take the choice of acknowledging them rather than including them as an author.
How much maximum authors can a paper have?
Okay, how many maximum authors the paper can have? I don't think there's any hard and fast limit. Somebody was asking me what is the maximum number of authors I have seen. I think the last paper, the one which I know about, is the paper which discovered the last quark. And I think that paper had in excess of 450 authors. So if you look at the paper, there is these pages of authors, and then there's a small section about how they discovered this new quark. The overall paper is quite short. Okay, so there isn't a hard and fast rule, but there is the expectation that people would have contributed to the work. Okay. For my journal, the policy is if you have more than 5 authors then you have to clearly indicate what each author contributed. Okay. The practice in authorship tends to differ between different disciplines. Okay. So this is also something you need to keep in mind. In some disciplines, the concept of authorship is more inclusive. Other disciplines, it's expected that everybody must have contributed to the methodology and to what is now in the paper in order to be listed as an author. So you should keep that in mind and learn from the people who are in that discipline. Other questions?
Generally in chemistry, it is there like in the lab, everybody is listed out in the as the author. So there are many authors like 456 others.
And in some situations, the effort is done collaboratively, like maybe you're in a lab, people work collaboratively, and in that case, it's appropriate to have the people who contributed to the work listed in this paper. I touched upon this. This is a matter of etiquette, it's not a matter of ethics. Dual submissions are completely taboo in the world of scientific publishing. It's not acceptable that you submit the same work in two venues for review at the same time. Okay. There's not anything fundamentally wrong with it, because you could say, okay, I will see which one accepts the work first, which one responds sooner, and then proceed. So fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with it, but this practice is completely taboo in the world of scientific publishing. Why?
Waste of time for
It is going to consume a lot of resources of people who are usually much more experienced than you. Okay, so you waste a lot of resources in this process. It usually also does not help the author. It does not save you time. It actually ends up costing you more time, because more often than not, the paper will go to the same reviewer, and the reviewer will say, wait a minute, these people have submitted the same thing to two places. They will tell both places. What will both places do? Reject, and you're back to ground zero. Okay. So it's not going to save you time by trying to submit to two places, see which one responds sooner. Okay. Some fake arguments you have against this. I was going to see which one is faster. I already told you that it's not really a valid argument. Also, the second argument you may have is maybe I submitted to this journal first, it was taking too much time, so I submitted to a different place. That's also not acceptable. If that happens, the appropriate thing for you to do is contact the associate editor, send them an email. Okay. And sometimes, usually they will respond, indicate to you what is the holdup. Things are human after all, there are human processes. Sometimes people have events in their life that delay the review or the decision process. Okay. You're also in your rights to withdraw the manuscript. If you think it's taking too long, you can withdraw and then submit elsewhere. But you cannot submit at the same time. There are also issues in terms of copyright. When you submit to a publisher, you're often transferring the copyright at that time itself, committing to transfer the copyright, so you can no longer submit the same thing somewhere else. Okay. Any questions? Sure.
So if I have submitted one paper and it is under review process, can I use it in my second paper for a reference?
Yes, you can use it in a second. In fact, if you're submitting a second paper which is closely related, it's incumbent upon you to cite that, because you're aware of that prior work, so you should cite that. And the journal will normally require you to submit that paper which is under review along with the new paper that you're submitting, so people can look at the extent of overlap and also possibly validate any methods that you may be reusing from there. So, as if on cue, you asked the right question. This slide is about disclosure and double publication. So, as an author, it is your responsibility to disclose all relevant work that you are aware of. Okay. Now, what is relevant or not, you may have some arguments on, but you can normally make a relative judgment. Okay. And in particular, your own work, which is closely related, you cannot claim I was not aware of it. Okay. So you cannot claim that I did not cite it because I was not aware of it. So your own work, which is under review elsewhere, you should clearly cite, and if necessary, provide a copy of that as part of the review process. It's not acceptable to publish the same work in two journal papers. Okay. Conference to journal overlap, this practice varies by discipline. Look at the guidance that the journal provides. Even in this situation, disclosure is important. You should always disclose your prior conference paper if you have a subsequent journal paper based on that. Okay. So I already touched upon this. These publication metrics are just one measure of the relevance of a journal. They are measures of popularity and often of sensationalism, not necessarily of scientific impact. Okay. What is also happening in the community is often reviewers are suggesting to authors they should cite the reviewers' papers, okay, because these metrics have taken a life of their own. That conduct is considered acceptable, considered unacceptable, not acceptable. IEEE now classifies that as bibliometric manipulation. So actions taken by anybody in the review process, the editor-in-chief, the associate editor, the reviewers, which the sole aim is to increase citation counts, either of the journal or of the person involved, are now considered as bibliometric manipulation. And these situations, if you complain, IEEE will take appropriate action. So don't feel pressured by reviewers. If the reviewers give you, cite these 15 papers, which are clearly the reviewers' papers and not directly relevant, point out to the associate editor. If the associate editor says, no, you have to address these, contact the editor-in-chief. Normally, they will act in good faith. Same thing when you review papers and when you cite papers which are relevant, not just for the purpose of influencing citation count. So some comments. The broad ethics and etiquette practices are common between disciplines. What's right and wrong is usually fairly obvious. But in terms of details of etiquette, there are often differences. Just like we have a fairly diverse country, there are a lot of different customs in different parts of the country. Same thing in the publishing world. There are different communities which may have different etiquette. Okay. So when you are in doubt, the best thing is to be polite and to err on the side. It's a whole process that you have to then deal with. One other comment I'll make is the dynamics of publishing are changing today. The world is much more connected electronically. That allows you to collaborate with people remotely and work with people over great distances, making you more productive. But the expectations that you will adopt appropriate ethics and etiquette practices do not go away. So make sure in these remote collaborations, you give due attention to these aspects also. If there's somebody who's less aware than this of you that you're collaborating with, please mentor them appropriately. Okay? If you're collaborating with somebody, yeah. I'll also mention Orchid. Orchid is the author disambiguation tool. This is something which is a unique identifier that authors have. This is free. You can go and register. What it accomplishes is for someone like me, when I was flying to Delhi from Bangalore, the airline agent asked me, when I gave my passport, where is your travel booking? There are 3 Guarav Sharmas on this plane. Which one are you? Okay. All right. So by having a unique ID, that helps you disambiguate which author's contributions are which in common name situations. This is also increasingly being used by various institutions, government agencies, and funding agencies to track what a particular researcher is doing or particular institutions are doing. So I would strongly recommend you should get an ORCID and use it. IEEE actually requires ORCIDs. The corresponding author is required to have an ORCID in order to complete a submission, and it's strongly recommended for other authors. It's not enforced at the moment, but that is also coming as we proceed. I think in the interest of time, I'll skip where to publish. There are a variety of journals that IEEE offers, okay, and there are open access publications, which you will hear from in a while from Colin. I already touched upon impact factor. This is not a great measure to use about the significance of a journal. There are some other metrics which are also used. In particular, what you should look at is what is the reputation of the journal in the community that the journal operates in. That's a bigger consideration. And if there's a new or lesser known journal, look at the editorial board. Look, is there a scholarly society which is known in this area that is involved in publishing it? Who are the members of the editorial board? In particular, it takes normally 3 years for a journal to get indexed. Until the journal is indexed, the journal does not have, the articles there are not indexed and not part of, there's no impact factor. Okay. Those journals may still be relevant. Okay. If your publication as a student is required to be an index journal, obviously I would not advise you to submit there. Submit in a more established one. If on the other hand you're an established researcher, this may not be a consideration for you. If this is the new and emerging area for your topic to publish, then this is the appropriate thing to submit to a new journal. Okay. So make decisions appropriately based on your own interest. There are other ways also that can be used to assess the significance of a journal. IEEE provides a number of these pieces of information, such as number of downloads, patent citations, other metrics such as eigenfactor score, article influence score, and a variety of other metrics. There are also a broad class of article level metrics called alt metrics, which are available in terms of indicating whether a paper is viewed, discussed, saved, cited, and so on.
Legal factor score. Never heard of this. Legal factor score.
Okay. Yeah, rather than give you a tutorial on this here, I would suggest you look up the Wikipedia page. If you search for this, you will find this on Wikipedia as a description of how it's computed. Finally, before I end, I would like to strongly encourage you to volunteer and participate in your community. There is a tremendous dearth of reviewers at this point in time. If you're a faculty member, if you get a request to review in an area which you have expertise, you should normally try and help with the review. And in the process of reviewing, you will also learn, because you will read new material. If you're a student, offer your help to your advisor. Tell them if you have requests for reviews, I can help you with that. Okay? And the way I mentor my own students is early on, when they join my group, if I get a request to review which is relevant to a problem that a student is working on, I will do the review, but I will also ask the student to do a review. I will integrate the two to submit the final review and share that with the student as an example for what is a reasonable review. When their review starts getting good enough to the point where it would be an independent review, and I get a review to request on a topic and I do not have the time, I tell the journal, I cannot do this review, but please contact my student. He is qualified and can do a good review. And that's how you grow the pool of valid reviewers. Okay. So please participate in this process. In terms of ethics issues, conformance should be an outcome of like-mindedness and not the result of weakness. You have a spine, use it. Okay. Stand up to an appropriate pressure. There's no reason to do something just because others are saying this is what you have to do. If it's inappropriate, you should be able to say, no, this doesn't make sense. And ethical misconduct reflects poorly not only on you, but also on your co-authors, your institution, and to some extent on the country also. If people start saying, okay, papers from India often have ethics problems, that becomes something which then first thing people will look at when there's an author from India is, are there any ethics concerns? Okay? So you do not want to get in that stereotype. I have some references. These you can find access to in the slides. The first ones are about writing. The second one's about publication ethics. And these will be available to you online. In summary, IEEE offers a wide variety of publication options between journals and conferences, open access and conventional. These are among the most prestigious in the electrical engineering and computer science communities. As an author and scientist, you carry your reputation as well as that of your institution and your co-authors, so pay due attention to publication ethics and etiquette. I'll be glad to take any questions that you have. I think I've already used more than my allocated time.
Does the order of authors really matter in the publication?
Does the order of authors really matter in the publication? So that depends on what community you're publishing in and what you're using that for later. Okay. So the first author is clearly acknowledged as the person who has substantially contributed to the work. That's almost universal in all communities. Okay. So the lion's share of the credit invariably goes to the first author, unless you indicate by saying equal contribution. So you can indicate if there are two people, two students who worked equally hard on a certain problem and it was published, you can indicate equal contribution among the different people who contributed. Okay. In certain communities, the last author has a special significance. That's usually the senior author, the one who sort of designed the study and maybe contributed to this. Where does it matter? You subsequently apply for funding. They will look at how much sort of individual contributions you had and how much contributions you had in a senior author. Okay. However, there's not one rule. Different communities will follow different practices. In certain communities, they will follow the practice of listing authors in alphabetic order. Okay. So, yeah, I don't think there's one hard and fast answer. Yeah. Other questions? All right, so then I will hand over to Colin.